chair of the Book of the Year Award Committee for the Academy, and we want to welcome you to our event this evening. And we're going to be meeting our Book of the Year winner, as well as announce the top 10 books on our top 10 list. But before we do that, I want to invite our president for the Academy, Reverend Barbara Lorback, to come and give a brief welcome to all of you.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to have you on our event this night for the Book of the Year, and I am so grateful to the Academy. This is one of our highly anticipated moments of our annual conferences. Since we're not able to do the annual conference, to be able to do this Book of the Year presentation via virtual media is wonderful. We look forward to hearing from our author tonight. And I want to also give a special thanks to our Book of the Year committee. They read, I don't know how many different books to come up with this, chaired by Bob Cornwall, as you just met, and Jess Skolton and Ron Green. And so we are grateful for the work that you put in to get us to this evening. Welcome, and just a reminder that when we are not speaking, we should be on mute this evening so that we can be sure to hear all of the wonderful things that will be shared with us. Welcome.
So thank you, Barbara, for that welcome. Just a couple of reminders to everyone. Later on in our event, we'll have some Q&A. So if you have some questions, please have those ready, and Jess will take care of those for our awardee tonight. Just another word, the Academy of Parish Clergy has been in existence since the late 1960s as a professional support network. We have a journal and a variety, and we usually have an annual meeting, as Barbara said, but unfortunately COVID has canceled the last two. But thanks to Zoom, we're able to bring the Book of the Year awards to you in this fashion. And so from our various homes, we are doing this. Our first thing we're going to do is to share briefly our top 10 list. Just a couple of things about what we do. As Barbara noted, we circulate an invitation to publishers, invite them to submit nominated books. Some publishers will send us 2 or 3 books, and other publishers will send us several boxes. So we just never know what we're going to get. But we have a wide variety of books to choose from, and it's hard to do that. We are one of the criteria is that we're looking for books that would benefit clergy and their ministries, and we're an interfaith inclusive organization. So we're looking not just at Christian books, which most of the books publishers that we're working with are Christian publishers, but we want to look more broadly than that. And so Jess, Ron, and I each read our books and did some, put our own recommendations, and then we negotiated out of that essentially 11 books that we would recommend. And there were lots of books, and we could have gone a lot of different ways. But these are the ones we narrowed down and could agree on. But the most important one is the Book of the Year. And so we're going to get to that just momentarily. So what we're going to do is share the top 10 list. And Ron, I think, is leading off with the first of them. And we'll just share the book in a brief statement, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Bob. These books are in alphabetical order. And so our first book by Todd Billings, I think, is both timeless and timely. I'm very aware that everybody's had to face their mortality during this pandemic. And because we have not had adequate opportunities to grieve together, we're going to deal with grief for years to come. And Todd Billings knows about that because he's been living with terminal cancer since the age of 39. And so he talks about his own mortality and brings a spirituality and a theology of death and dying, as well as the ethics that are involved. Let's be honest, most of our church people have their ideas of what happens after death more from movies and cartoons than they do scripture. But he addresses this. I highly recommend it for pastors to read, especially during this particular time.
Okay, so our next book is Native: Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God from Caitlin Curtis. And one of the themes of several of the books of the year is just the power of storytelling. And so that's what we really get from Curtis in this. She is a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation and also a Christian and a poet. And you experience all of those as she goes through, referencing frequently the story of the prodigal son and what homecoming means and what that identity and belonging is and the various aspects of that. She writes as part of the conclusion, what if all of this whole journey, the beginning, the searching, the knowing, the working, the fruit that comes from the work, what if it is all the work of knowing and being known? And that's sort of the theme of the book, is her understanding and learning of herself and of things of faith and things that are meaningful as part of the Potawatomi Nation as well. And she says, maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point of beginning again. And maybe, just maybe, that's the promise of the new world will always bring us. And so it's really, the book ends with a very hopeful understanding of the ways that we can seek together racial reconciliation, deconstructing racism, thinking about decolonization and what it means to be part of community and to belong into a new day. It's a great book. It's a great read and great storytelling. The Lost Art of Dying. When I started this book, I feel like I could advertise that if you buy the book and you aren't hooked by the first story in that book also, I'd reimburse your cost of it, because it is such a powerful testimony to, well, as Ron was talking about in the first book that was listed, this understanding in our culture of what death and dying is and what is of value in that process. So Dr. Doug Dale goes through many, many stories and talks about them, but I thought this was a really helpful one that might just capture that. So I just have a few sentences of that story, but she tells the story of a woman who just could not accept her own process of dying. And so really just insisted that her family surround her with positivity and not thinking about what could happen. And then her son writes of this after his mother's death. He describes how he and all who were close to Sontag in her final months conspired to speak words of hope rather than truth. And that was what she wanted. But such a conspiracy made it impossible to tell her that she was dying. They could not say goodbye properly or fully express their love for her. To do so would be to admit defeat. As a result, Reef writes, she who feared isolation and had the most terrible difficulties connecting with people had the loneliest of deaths. And this concept of dying in community and cultural awareness, and throughout the history, how we can die well, that it is an art, and that we have sort of turned our backs on that, is just significant and powerful. Again, wonderful storytelling, and I promise you'll be hooked from the first few pages. The Me Too Reckoning. Ruth Everhart is a Presbyterian pastor, and she, like so many of these authors on our list this year, does this brilliant job of telling her own experience of sexual harassment in the church and what that means for how she was shaped as a pastor, and then the multiple stories of other folks who have experienced very painful sexual misconduct within the church, and the church's lack of response to it. She's not always sarcastic, but sometimes she is very sarcastic. And she made a list that she said she put on her computer, and it never went anywhere until she shared it in the book. But it talks about 7 easy steps for churches confronting difficult truths. And so this is all tongue in cheek. She is not suggesting this, but these are the things that are happening in the church. Number 1, avoid hearing the truth. There are many effective types of earplugs, or you can simply clamp your hands over your ears. Pretend you don't understand what's wrong. Protect persons in power, right? These are all the kinds of unwritten rules that are happening in the church that are causing so much damage. And she calls them out and she speaks truth into that. And it has a solid scriptural foundation. And there's a hopefulness to addressing the truth of this reckoning, of this way that exposes the abuse in the church, and hope for ways to move forward. So powerful book, all sorts of trigger warnings for folks who have experienced sexual assault within the church and sexual harassment, but in a hopeful and mostly gentle way that helps to care for those who have received that abuse and experience the truth of it to move forward.
So I introduced to you the next book, After Evangelicalism, The Path to a New Christianity by David P. Gushee. David, several years ago, was a leading evangelical ethicist and theologian. He wrote a book called Changing Our Mind, in which he shared a change of heart and change of mind regarding the inclusion of LGBTQ folks in church and society. And that led to basically him getting kicked out of evangelicalism. And so he's written a number of books that deal with that question. And for those of us who have deep roots in evangelicalism and have found ourselves outside that realm, this book will resonate, I believe. He wrote the book in part to refute critics and those within white evangelicalism taking a road that he believed was a wrong road. But he also wrote the book because he was encountering more and more people who had evangelical roots, but were finding that it no longer worked for them and they didn't know where to go. And so what he offers here is a pathway that he believes, and I believe, can help people stay within the faith tradition, even if the tradition that they thought nurtured them no longer worked. So it's really an excellent book. It's one more step in David's own journey, and it's a journey that a number of us have taken along with him. So it's just a really helpful book, I believe. But it's a little bit polemical, so just be aware of that.
James Henry Harris begins his book with this quote from almost a year ago. "I can't breathe." George Floyd's last cry for help. And he goes on from there. Again, very, very timely for us. As Bob was talking about evangelicals living beyond that evangelicalism, we know that people of all faith traditions struggle with racism, and people of color struggle with how to cope with the systemic racism as well as the individual incidents that are going on. And James Henry Harris brings a powerful reflection on particular African-American perspective. The historical significance and how people have who have been outspoken, speaking up for Black rights, have been then literally and figuratively tarred and feathered. We blame the victim and we discount their story and the contemporary significance. And so as our people and as we ourselves deal with the Chauvin guilty verdict and wait to see what kind of sentence will be handed down, this would be a great book to lead us, to read first yourself and then to lead a study on, especially for us white people, to understand, as the title says, the silent pain and the hidden hope. And I do have hope that we're going to move out of this as a society.
Mm.
Oh, I'm doing the next one too. Sure. Celebrating the graying church. And I'm one of these people. And Richard P. Olson retired, and then kind of, as many people do, found a second career in retirement, and then moving beyond retirement. And it's not just about ministry to people, the aging people. How can they offer their gifts of wisdom and insights and perspective, including irreverence? He talks about humor. It's very good. But it deals with the realities. It would help younger pastors in particular, and those of us who are past middle age, to understand the other gift is that it's one of the books that came out last year in 2020 that does have a chapter on what it meant to live in the pandemic. If we think we have isolation, people in the assisted living facilities, I mean, it's really been rough. And so I'm hoping that we can come out of this with and ministry today, legacies tomorrow.
So the next book is called Brown Church by Robert Chao Romero, 5 Centuries of Latino Social Justice, Theology, and Identity. It's from InterVarsity Press. Romero is a professor of Chicano Studies and Asian American Studies at UCLA. So he brings those two parts of his own life, the mixture of being Asian American and Latino, into a conversation. And so this is part history, part theology, part social science, and part his own story. And he writes the book, he shares right up front, he wrote the book in large part because he was discovering students at UCLA, where he teaches, Latina students, who had concluded that Christianity is a white man's religion. And he wanted to be able to share with his students that that's not necessarily true. And that he writes that even as there's a Black church, there's a brown church. And it's been in existence for 500 years. And so he tells that story historically in a variety of ways. And it's really a powerful book. And along with some of the other books like Caitlin Curtis's book and James Henry Harris's book, this adds one more piece to the conversation that's really an important one. And so it's an excellent book. It's a great read. It will open eyes and open conversations. And it's just a reminder that those of us who live in the United States, especially those of us who lived in California before it was part of the United States, it was part of Mexico. And before that, it was part of Spain. And so there's a long legacy in history that just we need to be reminded of. And this is an excellent introduction to that. So the next one, I guess I have most of the last of the few books here. Thinking About God by Jewish Views by Rabbi Kerry Tolling. We've been fortunate the last couple of years to have found a Jewish publisher to contribute to our conversation. This is part of a series of books that are written for the Jewish community to answer essential questions of the faith. And what she does in the book is take up a series of questions that Jews are talking about regarding the nature of God. What's helpful is that she deals with Hebrew scripture and shares from that, but it's also the history and the theology and the rabbinic teachings that add to that and expand upon the biblical text, which I think for me as a Christian, books like this are really helpful because we get a fuller picture of what Judaism is all about. And so I'm just thankful that the Jewish Publication Society contributed a book to our conversation, and that we would be able to include it in our top 10 because there's so much to learn. It's a thick book, so it sort of serves as a reference book in some ways because you can pick and choose where you need to go based on the questions that you have about God. And the last one, it has to do with, it's called, I have to get my note here, Neighbors, Christians and Muslims Building Community Together by Deanna Ferry Moamak. It's from Westminster John Knox Press. And it's an interesting book in that it's really designed to help congregations, Christian congregations, learn about Islam, but also not just learn about Islam, but create opportunities for building community, for working together and experiencing life together. Because within these two communities, there's often a major disconnects and misunderstandings. Of course, lots of stereotypes, especially among Christians about Muslims and Islam. So she deals with a lot of that. It's not a long book, but the most important piece here is helping us move towards relationships with one another. Now, here's the other component of it. A lot of the practical pieces that she shares in the book for Christian-Muslim relations can be useful for Christian relationships or interfaith relations across the board. So it may speak specifically to Christian-Muslim relations, but the principles and the practical applications, can be used across the line. So it's designed to be used in congregations to build those communities. And it's really an excellent book that's going to be really useful. And so I recommend it highly. And so it's one of those things that it's the time and place for us to build relationships. And here's one more opportunity to do that. And with that, I think we bring our top 10 books to a close, which then leads us to the presentation of our Book of the Year award winner, which the book is called Defiant, What the Women of Exodus Teach Us About Freedom. And the author is Kelley Nikondeha. Is that how I pronounce your name? Okay, good. With a foreword by Sarah Bessie. And it's just a wonderful book. And you're going to get to hear from Kelley about the book. What's wonderful about the book is that she weaves together the biblical story and contemporary stories. And this isn't the first time she's done that, because a couple of years ago, she wrote a book called Adopted, which was a top 10 book. But what is wonderful about that, well, let me just put it this way, because you're going to get to hear from a minute. When I read Adopted, I loved it. And so I was a fan of her work from day one. And so when we got Defiant as a possibility, I was excited because I wanted to be able to share it with other people. So you get to do this tonight. And with that, I'm just going to invite Kelley. I should note that the book is published by Erdman's, William B. Erdman's publishing company. And I know they're excited that we're able to honor Kelley's book tonight. So Kelley, it's all up to you. And then when Kelley's finished sharing some about the book, we're going to have some Q&A time. So there'll be some opportunities to ask some questions. So Kelley, it's up to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I was so honored and am honored and humbled to have Defiant selected as your book of the year. And I'm so excited to know that this will be, I hope, life-giving for congregations across our country. So thank you again for the warm reception to this book. When I first approached the Exodus story, I guess I didn't notice that the original practitioners of liberation were women. They were hidden behind Moses and Aaron all my years growing up, like these little hidden figures way back that, you know, I barely heard or saw them. And so this is really kind of my own story of coming to see and notice these women and what they have to offer the church. And I think that the message that they can offer us in these current times. So the seed for this book, I'm going to give you the origin story for Book of the Year. The seed for this book actually was in Adopted, the first book that I wrote. So I'm an adopted person and I have adopted children. So I'm also an adopted mother. So adoption bookends my understanding of family. And as I was writing about a practical theology of adoption, the Exodus story gave me an archetype for what an adopted family looks like. You see a birth mother, you see an adoptive mother, and you see an adopted child, all the way into adulthood even. And so I just leaned hard into this family and their story. But when I was done writing Adopted, these women, the mothers in particular, were not done with me. Because I recognized these women weren't only part of an adoption story, they were part of a liberation story. They rescued Moses. They didn't just, relinquish and receive. They rescued him from the terrible injustice of his world, of Egypt at that time. And so when I recognize them as mothers and liberation practitioners, I started to pull the lens back and recognize there were all these other women. It wasn't just these two mothers. We found the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. We would hear about young Miriam and Miriam in her advanced age. We would hear about 7 sisters in Midian, one of them who would end up marrying Moses. And then we hear, so these are we circle back to Miriam, as I said. So all these women are involved. And once I saw them, once I recognized what they contributed to our understanding of liberation, I couldn't unsee them. They became the most compelling women in the Bible for me. And so I have deep affection for these women. But really, this was just kind of my own, right? This was my own devotion, my own exploration of the text as I just, continued leaning into the stories of these amazing women. And then the 2016 election happened. And I was invited up to Canada to speak to a group of women. We were a mixed group of women, Canadian, American, brown-skinned women, light-skinned women. We were immigrants, mixed-raced, mothers, single mothers, aunties, retirees, empty nesters. But all of us were shook by what happened in 2016 with that election. And every one of the women in that room shared throughout the course of the weekend about their own fears for their own safety and the safety of their families in the years ahead. And when I was invited as one of the speakers to this event, I was asked to answer one question. What does it look like when women rise? And so this was the first time that I ever preached about the Exodus women, because they were the answer to the question. This is what it looks like when women rose in the ancient story. And I believe it's still what it looks like when women rise. We create conditions for liberation. That room, as I preached, was buzzing. It was electric. The women were so engaged with the story of these their Exodus matriarchs. And I was so excited to be able to tell their story for the first time, like in a grand landscape, just to go deep and share. And, we come to the 45-minute mark when I'm supposed to be done preaching. And the woman who's convening the evening waves me on, kind of like, you're at third base, take it all the way home. She tells me to keep going. So I preach beyond the 45 minutes I planned. And then we had a question and answer time for almost an hour after. So we were like talking about these women for a couple hours. And the women in the room had questions. They had observations from their own life. I mean, it's like we were unpacking together, learning together about these women and how they could be a model for us in the next set of years, in what we felt was a time of a Pharaoh of our own. I mean, it's how we really felt. And when I got done, it was the end of the night, people started going back to their cabins. One of my friends, who happens to also be my book agent, came up to me and said, "That is your next book." Because what she recognized, she said, was there was a hunger in the room. There was a hunger for a better story and a way to understand how to lean into this new season. And she said, I also had a bit of passion about these women. And so she said, your energy, but the hunger of the women, that's what makes this work, this has to be the next thing that you explore. And so that really is how Defiant came to be. That is the origin story within a community of women. It was Edelette McVicker inviting me to share and answer the question about what it looks like when women rise. It was Rochelle Gardner, my agent, saying, that's it. It was Lil Copan acquiring it for Erdman's. And it was all those women that cold February night in Chilliwack, Canada, with their curiosity. So in a sense, Defiant was birthed among women, which, how appropriate is that? But what is this book really about? Well, Exodus begins listing the names of the 12 sons, Jacob's sons. These are the 12 names, and the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew text, even that's how we know what the Exodus is called, the book of names, the 12 names of the men. Now, in Hebrew literature, names are important, but so are numbers. And the number 12 has always had a lot of significance. It is the tribal leadership. When you hear the 12 sons of Nahor, or the 12 chieftains of Ishmael, or when you hear about leadership structures in the region, they're always 12 men, to be honest. That was the cultural expectation. So we're not only seeing at the beginning of Exodus 12 names of one tribe as in a genealogy, we're also seeing a leadership structure emerge. These are the leaders. But then the Exodus narrator does a curious thing, because he begins telling this story about this epic emancipation by telling the story through the lens of women, mothers, sisters, wives, midwives, neighbors, 12 of them. And so we start to see, there's another leadership structure in operation here. This one, the women. And so one of the first things when I thought about the three things I wanted to highlight about Defiant tonight. One of them is that it takes the full complement of men and women for us to move forward in liberation work in our communities. You needed those 12 sons of Jacob. You also need the 12 women. You need the fullness. You need both men and women working together for full liberation. And I love that Exodus brings those together for us. The second point that I would love to talk about is just what these women did. What did liberative practice look like in this story? And I can give you a real short summary, which is the women defied Pharaoh, rescued Moses, and plundered Egypt. So, defiance. Shiphrah and Puah, the two midwives, defied Pharaoh's edict to kill baby boys. They organized the first act of civil disobedience that we have recorded in the Bible. Strong, clever women. But then we have this big rescue narrative where we have Jochebed, the birth mother of Moses. We have Pharaoh's daughter. Jewish tradition calls her Bethia, who adopts him. These two mothers finding a way to save this baby. And young Miriam, maybe she was 13 or 14 at the time, introduces them. And so begins this unorthodox partnership that maybe was only possible in the imagination of a young woman. We will later hear more from Miriam in her advanced age and the ways in which she led the people out and across the sea with her brother. But even Zipporah, the wife of Moses, in the middle of the night, pulls out a sharp flint and saves him. I mean, rescue while he was a baby, rescue while he was an adult. And as I said, plundered Egypt. It was a huge act of neighborliness that allowed all the treasure of Egypt to move from Egyptian hands to Hebrew hands. And on the way out, that was how Egypt was, that was how the Egyptian economy made reparations. It was through neighborliness, or what the text will call plunder. So this is what it looks like when women engage in liberative practice, defying Pharaoh, rescuing Moses, plundering Egypt. I would say that this is what it looks like when we are faithful in troubled times. This is what faithfulness looks like. And the last thing I'd love to say about the message of Defiant is that what we see is the narrator of Exodus is playing around with the gender roles a bit. So on one hand, we have these women of Exodus who are doing quite normal things. They are mothers and daughters and neighbors, and yet they subvert those domestic safe roles. So relinquishing a child, raising a child, adopting a child, being a nursemaid, neighborliness, these very normal things are subverted for the sake of justice. And we also see women doing things that we don't expect them to do. We expect them to be mothers and neighbors and sisters, but we don't expect them to be shepherds, maybe. We don't expect them to maybe be sacramental practitioners who are well-versed with a sharp flint, knowing how to save somebody in the middle of the night. We don't maybe expect them to be community organizers. And yet here they are as a picture of faithfulness, doing what we don't often expect or talk about women doing. So I love that Exodus, this story does a little bit of both of those things. And I think that's another part of Defiant that I love, is the ways in which what we expect can be subverted, but also things we completely don't expect become part of the story too. So I've been asked to share a little bit about what it means to have written this book. And personally, this book has transformed me. It has changed the way that I have seen and understood women, not just in our homes, but in our churches and out in public. I think I have always been wondering, is there a compelling way for a woman to be involved? My mother was involved in church ministry, and I grew up seeing her lead women doing the softer side of ministry, doing all the wonderful things that made the church beautiful, and fundraising efforts and all that. And I loved the heart she put into the church, but it wasn't compelling for me. That just wasn't maybe that wasn't my gift but then I saw these women and it was like, oh, this is how I'm invited to bring my gifts and my energy into the church. So it really transformed my understanding of what's possible for women, myself included. But man, those mothers, Jochebed and Bethia, I feel like they have me arm in arm, each in their turn, transforming me. I feel most alike and more kinship with Bethia, Pharaoh's daughter, because like her, I was raised in the courts of Pharaoh as a light-skinned, educated, well-resourced woman in America. I had all the advantages and ease, and maybe we would even say privilege. And yet I had to be invited. I needed other women to invite me into the work of justice, to seeing where I stood socially, to know my social location, to name my own complicity, and to start to kind of dismantle some of that in my own story, so that then I could walk in solidarity with my sisters on the other side of the river. And so I have that kinship with Bethia. But we're also both adopted moms. And I marvel at her because I think there's two things she did so well. She raised a son who knew that he was both Hebrew and Egyptian. Because when Moses wanted to go and connect with his tribe, he knew to go to the brickyards, right? She didn't steal that part of his story. She raised a son who knew his dual identity. And I have raised both a son and daughter from Burundi. And I hope I can learn from her that I'm raising children who know that they are both American and Burundian, and that they have access to the fullness of their identity and however God would want to use who they are as a gift to the world. But she also raised Moses in the house of Pharaoh. He understood justice. He knew what justice was and had a sense of how to pursue it. And I thought, man, if she can do that in Pharaoh's house, then maybe there's hope for me to raise my children, even as they have all the benefits of this wonderful American economy. I hope that they will be people who have a heart for justice for other economies and other places in the world. So she is a great mentor and inspiration to me personally. But I will tell you, writing this book, it was an honor to tell the story of these amazing women. And I hope a gift to the women in the church in particular who wondered, where's my place? Can I be out marching? Can I be involved politically? Is it part of my call to be a mother in ways that are liberative and teach my children about peacemaking? And I think these women tell us, yes, all of that is possible. They show us through their own story of defying pharaohs and raising and rescuing Moses and plundering Egypt, that all of those things can be ways in which we can engage in liberation. And I hope it's an encouragement to the women of the church and the men of the church that this is the work we get to do together, because we are still living in troubling times, and we need people who will know how to be, what faithfulness looks like. And I think these women show us. So it was an honor to tell their story, and I hope an encouragement to your congregations.
Excellent. Kelley, we're so thankful you're with us today. I'm I'm Jess Skolton. I'm the secretary on the board for the Academy of Parish Clergy, and I'm fielding question and answers. And well, I'm fielding questions. And so those of you that are live on Facebook, if you post those, I'm paying attention into those comments as well. So our first question comes from Barbara, and she's asking, did the sermon end up in the book? And for those of us that have read it, we have an idea of exactly your answer for that, but share with us, did the sermon end up in the book?
Well, the book is the longer form sermon because I was only beginning, like I said, it was the first articulation in public. And so I was just, I think I was still on the cusp. I had started to see these women, but of course I would dive deeper into their stories and see much more and be able to share much more in the book. But it began in the pulpit and then grew into the book. And now I can barely talk about, I could not do a single sermon about these women. I mean, I just think you have to do a series.
Right. There's 12 of them in the series. Okay, excellent. So you have so many fierce women in this, and because it doesn't just speak to the women who are the leaders in Exodus, but also women who have been leaders in Justice and Defiant throughout the ages. So I just have this vision of someone who's solving a mystery with all the pictures and the lines and the weaving together. What was the process like for writing these stories?
Well, I have lived long with these women. I think I have now been thick in their stories for about 10 years. And I think, this just as this happens with friends, as you get to know them deeply, you see resonance, you see, family resemblances, enough of their story to see, they remind you of your other friends over here. You start to see them echoed in your world. And the deeper I got to know these women in their world, I started to see the connections. These young Miriam, with all the moxie it took to go up to Pharaoh's daughter and say, I think you need a nursemaid, and I know the woman for you. I was like, well, that's Emma Gonzalez standing up to the NRA. That's ahead to Mimi standing up to, to the forces in her village that, were preying upon her and her family. You could even say, is it Darlene, the young 17-year-old woman who took that video of George
Darnella.
There we go. Who took that video, right? Even though she, there was pressure to not, but she stayed focused. I mean, how could I see young Miriam and not see her echoed in the world around me? And so I think that's where it just became natural to see, wow, these women, in a sense, women continue to incarnate, to embody the story of these women in the ways that we stand up for justice in our communities. So it just became kind of natural to weave them in. And I wanted to make sure that people saw this isn't just something that happens in the Bible. This is something that still happens now. And this is what it looks like now for people who kind of needed help to move from the imaginative space to no, this is what it looks like on the news at night. And this is maybe what it'll look like for you.
Yeah, I really appreciated that chapter because so often, we think about Miriam and her tambourine and the dancing and, that later life, but the fierceness of that early introduction and the honoring of, you say in the book, you have to listen to these voices if you want to know what's going on. And I just really appreciate how you highlighted that. Bob's asking, can you share something about the connection between the biblical women and the women you work with in Burundi and your ministry there and in your work there?
Mm-hmm. So my husband and I do development work, community development work in Burundi, which is a little country tucked away in East Africa. We like to call it the heart of Africa. And these women helped me start to see the women in the Exodus story. I mean, they contributed their own to me having my own epiphany. But when we started working with 30 families. So that's a pretty small project. And I remember we started off with the men, they came first. And about a month later, the women came. And I remember asking my husband, like, is it too soon for the women are going to come. I know that they'll create the home and they'll set up the food and all that, but I kind of wondered, will it slow down the work that the women are coming so soon? I mean, this shows you, I mean, really, I'm telling on myself because what a terrible community development person I was in the early days to think that the women would have slowed the process. Because what I actually learned by watching them over the next set of months is the amazing capacity of these women. So maybe about 4 or 5 weeks later, when we drove to visit the community, I remember when we got out of the car and we looked across the valley, there was like this colorful ribbon that kind of, went around the bend of the valley. And as we got closer, I could hear them singing in Kirundi, which is the language. And I could hear them singing. And they were all wearing their colorful igitenge, the African fabric. So they had all their, their clothes on, babies strapped on their back, and they were working the field. They were planting carrots or cabbage at the time. And it was like watching these women and realizing, wow, they are right in the thick of things. They had agency, capacity, the drive to contribute and make their world better for their families. And it was really through seeing them that I started to then look around and realize, wait a minute, there are women like that in my country. Back in, I grew up in California. There are women like that in California who make our community work. There are moms like that in my neighborhood. It's like somehow those women helped open my eyes to see, wow, the capacity of women. And then of course I look in the text and I'm like, well, of course there would be 12 women. Why am I surprised? But yeah, it was these beautiful Batwa women in Burundi that helped me see in real time so that I could then go back and see it in the text and see it in my own neighborhood.
Beautiful. So in some ways, as you write, I was struck by so much of it is about fierceness and courage and the beauty of that, but also the reminders of the pain of the situation in Egypt and what that, the visual that you strike us to of children dying in current events and, the naming of Trayvon, the naming of Trayvon Martin. And it just struck me that Lament, that you were in so many ways lamenting and saying their names. And so I wonder what the process of that felt like for you and how you experienced that.
Well, I mean, this has become a bit of a joke in my writing group because if I now comfortably say that I'm a liberation theologian. It took me time to own that because there's a certain amount of freight that comes with it. And I think I finally got old enough to just say, this is what it is. Liberation is the lens through which I see and understand the text. But I'm starting to say that maybe I'm also, a Lamentations theologian, because I find that everywhere I look, I see lament. I see the work of lament. So if you read Adopted, you'll see a big part of understanding part of the adoption story, I think, is grappling with the lament that happens because families can't be together initially, because children are pulled apart from their birth families because of the injustice involved. And of course, it was a Jochebed that helped me see that initially anyways, as a woman who didn't want to relinquish her son, but, Pharaoh's henchmen were breathing down the back of her neck and all that injustice was on her shoulders. What was she going to do? Relinquishing him was the deepest act of love she could think of in the moment, because of the injustice that she had to survive, and she wanted her son to survive. And I think we have to lament the ways in which injustice impinges upon us and pushes us into these places. And so, I think when we see the women come to the other side of the river once, there's this beautiful emancipation story, and the Egyptians have made way for the Hebrews to leave, and they get to the other side, and you think, oh, they're just all celebrating that all the Egyptians have drowned in the Red Sea. And again, it's our Jewish neighbors who tell us, no, that's not the whole story. God was weeping at the loss of life. And I assume the women would have too, because they would have known that loss. So I guess I see lament everywhere. Right now I'm working on a book on Advent, and when it starts with lament. I think part of what lament does is it forces us to name the truth of things, the way in which things are broken, the way in which the world isn't working, and we are brokenhearted, and our bodies are broken, and our communities are broken. And if we don't begin with truth telling, then I don't think we can get beyond that. So I see lament as such a key part of our theology and praxis. So.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much. I have like 18 more questions, but we're we're out of time. And I'm so grateful for the amount of yourself that you share in these stories as well. And so that you're willing to share the really real of all of that. So thank you. And this has been delightful. I don't know who our official closer is here for the evening. Bob's going to unmute here in just a second. There we go.
There we go. Well, Kelley, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Wish we were able to do this in person, but this is the next best thing. And look forward to the next book on Advent. I expect it will, I'm not sure, you haven't revealed your publisher yet, but hopefully they will submit to the next round here. So we were blessed. The book is wonderful. If you've not read it, out there in the land of watching, this is one of those books, along with Adopted, that I think, I'm not sure which one. I kind of say read Adopted first, and then read Defiant, but read them both. They're wonderful books. And I just have to say this, my experience, and one of the reasons why I was looking forward to meeting you and hearing you is you're such a wonderful storyteller. And so to be able to I figured you'd be not just in writing, but that do the same in person. So it really has been a blessing. Thank you so much. Thank you all for those of you who joined us this evening. Thank you to Erdman's for number one, publishing the book and bringing to light a wonderful writer and storyteller. So thank you all this evening. The one last thing just to share is that on May 6th at 4 Eastern time, we will reveal the reference book of the year. So put that on your calendar, and it should be a great conversation but I'm not going to reveal that yet. Well, it is actually.
I was going to say, are we not allowed to tell?
I guess we've already revealed it. So it's the Bible with and without Jesus, how Jews and Christians read the same stories differently we pronounce the name differently, so different people, but Amy Jill Levine, I call Levine, my name is Levine, we'll find out for sure. And then Mark V. Bretler. So what's great about it is that the Book of the Year winner told the story from the Hebrew Bible, who's a Christian, and we'll have conversation about the way the story with Jesus is told in conversation with Jewish scholars. So it's one of those things that it's great crossover, and together Defiant and the Bible with and without Jesus are powerful books and wonderful books. And so join us on May 6th at 4 p.m. Eastern, and whatever that is time zone for you. It should be a great evening or afternoon with conversation. So good night, everyone. Matt, do you have any final things to add to this from the tech person?
I do not, except that we'll be posting links to this on our Facebook page and onto our web page as well. So if you like to view it on the cloud via Zoom or on Facebook, it is streaming right now, and we will post that. And my personal thanks to Kelley for sharing your stories and your journey with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Grace.
Good night, everybody.
All right, good night.